We now continue with our narration of Yogi Ramacharaka's Mystic Christianity. In the immediately preceding video, we covered part 2 of lesson 2, which was called the Mystery of the Mystery of the Virgin Birth. And we ended with, in our next lesson, which is now this video, we'll take up with the narrative of the secret life of Jesus from the time of his appearance as a child at the temple among the elders, until when at the age of 30 years he appeared at the scene of the mystery of John the Baptist and began his own brief ministry of 3 years, which was closed by the crucifixion and ascension. This is a phase of subject of intense interest and startling nature because of the lack of knowledge of the occult traditions on the part of the general public. And now, lesson 3, the mystery, the mystic youth of Jesus. Now, in our last lesson, we promised to tell you the esoteric story of the youth of Jesus. And there's such a story to tell. Although the churches know little or nothing about it, the churches have nothing but the husks that have always been the property of the masses. The real kernels of truth have been possessed by the few elect ones. The legends of the mystic brotherhoods and occult orders have preserved the story intact. And you shall now be given the essence of the mystic legends and traditions. At the end of our first lesson, we left Joseph, Mary, and the infant Jesus in Egypt, the land to which they had flown to escape the wrath of the tyrant Herod. They dwelt in Egypt for a few years until the death of Herod. Then Joseph retraced his steps and returned to his own country, bringing with him his babe, his wife, and the babe. For some reasons unknown to those familiar with the legends and traditions, Joseph decided not to locate in Judea, but instead bent his way toward the coast and returned to Nazareth, where Mary and he had originally met and become betrothed. And so in Nazareth, the humble little mountain town of the boyhood days of Jesus were spent, the grinding poverty of the family being relieved, according to the occult legends, by the yearly presents of gold from the hands of disguised messengers of the Magi. The traditions relate that Jesus began his study of the Hebrew law when he was but 5 years of age. It's related that he displayed an unusual ability and a talent in the direction of mastering not only the text, but also the spirit of the Hebrew scripture, and far outstripped his fellow students. It's also related that he displayed an early impatience at the dreary formalism of his Hebrew teachers and a disposition to go right to the heart of the text before him, that he might discern the spirit animating it. So much was this the case that he frequently brought down upon his head the censure of his instructors, who overlooked the spirit of the teachings in their devotion to the forms and the words. Nazareth was an old-fashioned place, and its inhabitants were made the target for jests and witticisms of the people of Judea. The word Nazarene was synonymous with lout, boor, peasant, etc., to the residents of the more fashionable regions. The very remoteness of the town served to separate it in spirit from the rest of the country, but this very remoteness played an important part in the early life of Jesus. Nazareth, by reason of its peculiar location, was on the line of several caravan routes. Travelers from many lands traveled through the town and rested overnight, or sometimes for several days. Travelers from Samaria, Jerusalem, Damascus, Greece, Rome, Arabia, Syria, Persia, Phoenicia, and other lands mingled with the Nazarenes. And the traditions relate that Jesus, the child, would steal away and talk with some of these travelers as were versed in occult and mystic lore and would imbibe from their various founts of learning until he was as thoroughly informed on these subjects that the boy would often delight and astonish these traveling, he was as thoroughly informed on these subjects as many a mystic of middle age. The traditions have it that the boy would often delight and astonish these traveling occultists with his wonderful insight into their secret doctrines and knowledge. And it's also told that some of the wisest of these, seeing the nature of the child, would overstay their allotted time of sojourn, that they might add here and there to the various parts of the general occult lore possessed by the child. It's also taught that the Magi informed some of these travelers regarding the boy that they might impart to him some truth or teaching for which he was ready. Well, all right. So the boy grew in wisdom and knowledge, day by day, year by year, until finally there occurred an event in his life, which has since been the subject of greatest interest to all Christians and students of the New Testament, but which without the above explanation is not readily understood. The Feast of the Passover occurred in its allotted time of the year, April, when Jesus was in his 13th year. This feast was one of the most important in the Jewish calendar, and its observance was held as a most sacred duty by all Hebrews. It was the feast set down for the remembrance and perpetuation of that most important event in the history of the Jewish people, when the angel of death swept over all of Egypt's land, smiting the firstborn of child of every house of the natives, high and low, but sparing all the houses of the captive Hebrews who marked their door sills with the sacrificial blood as a token of their faith. Now, this is no place to give the explanation of this apparently miraculous event, which students now know to be due to natural causes. We merely mention it in passing. The lawgivers of Israel had appointed the Feast of the Passover as a perpetual symbol of this event, so important by the nation, and every self-respecting Jew felt obligated to take part in the observance and the sacrament. Every pious Jew made it a point to perform a pilgrimage to Jerusalem at the time of the Feast of the Passover, if he could in any way manage to do so. At the time of the Passover celebration of which we're speaking, Jesus had just entered into his 13th year, which age entitled him, under ecclesiastical law, to the privilege of sitting with the adult men of his race at the Passover supper, and also to publicly join with the male congregation in the Thanksgiving services in the synagogues. So on this year, he accompanied his father and mother to Jerusalem and made his second visit now to that holy city. It will be remembered here that his first visit there was made when he was an infant. He was carried thither from Bethlehem into his mother's arms in accordance with the Jewish law, at which time an aged priest and an old prophetess had publicly acknowledged the divine nature of the child. Okay, the Father, Mother, and the child. The divine Trinity of human relationship, Father, Mother, and child, traveled slowly over the highway that led from Nazareth to Jerusalem. The father and mother were concerned with the details of the journey, mingled with pious thoughts concerning the sacred feast in which they were to take part. But the boy's mind was far away from the things that were occupying his parents' thoughts. He was thinking over the deep mystic truths which he had so readily absorbed during the past few years. And he was looking forward in delightful anticipation to his expected meeting with the older mystics in the temples and the public places of Jerusalem. It must be remembered that underlying the Jewish ecclesiastical teachings and formalism, which were all that the mass of the people knew, there was a great store of Jewish occultism and mysticism known to the few elect. The Kabbalah, or Jewish occult writings, were closely studied by the learned Jews, and this work with other similar teachings were transmitted verbally from teacher to student and constituted the secret doctrine of the Hebrew religion. And it was toward the learned teachers of this secret doctrine that Jesus directed his mind and steps, although his parents knew it not. 4 or 5 days were consumed in the journey. And at last the holy city, Jerusalem, came into full view, the wonderful temple of Israel, showing plainly above the other buildings. The band of pilgrims, of which the family of Joseph formed a part, formed in orderly array and led by flute players, they solemnly marched into the streets of the holy city, and chanting the sacred songs used by the faithful upon this solemn occasion. And the boy walked with the rest, with head bowed, and eyes that seemed to see things far removed from the scene around them. And the Passover rites were carried out, the duties were performed, the ceremonies observed. The Passover feast extended over a full week, of which the first 2 days were the most important, and during which 2 days the obligatory ceremonies were performed. Each family made the offering of the sacrificial lamb. Each family baked and ate the unleavened bread. The beautiful idea of the Passover had degenerated into a horrible feast of blood. For it's related that upon these occasions over 250,000 of poor innocent lambs were slaughtered and offered up as a sacrifice pleasing to Jehovah, who was supposed to delight in this flood of the blood of innocents. In pursuance of this barbarous idea, the altars and the courts of the temple of the living God ran red with the lifeblood of these poor creatures, and the hands and the garments of the anointed priests of Jehovah were stained like those of butchers with the vanity of barbarous conception of deity, so that it might be fed. All of this for the glory of God. Think of it. Think of it. And think of the feeling that must have been aroused in the mystic mind of Jesus at this horrible sight. How his soul must have been outraged at this prostitution of the sacred rite. And what would have been his thoughts had he known that centuries after, a great religion would stand bearing his name, the followers of which would be carried away with this same false idea of sacrificial blood, which would be voiced in hymns about a fountain filled with blood flowing from Emmanuel's veins, and about sinners plunged beneath that bloody flood, losing all their guilty stains. Alas, for the prostitution of sacred truths and teachings. No wonder that a people so saturated with the abominable ideas of a deity delighting in this flow of blood should have afterward put to death the greatest man of their race. A being who came to bring them the highest mystic and occult truths. And their prototypes have survived through the centuries, even unto today, insisting upon this idea of blood sacrifice and death atonement, unworthy of any people except the worshippers of some heathen devil god in the most remote sections of darkest Africa. Disgusted and outraged by this barbarous sight, Jesus, the boy, stole away from the side of his parents and sought to the remote chambers and corridors of the temple, where were to be found the great teachers of the law and of the Kabbalah surrounded by their students. Here the boy sat and listened to the teachings and disputations of the teachers and exponents of the doctrines. From one group to another, he wandered, listened, pondered, and thought. He compared the teachings and submitted the various ideas to the touchstone of the truth as he found it within his own mind. The hours rapidly passed by unnoticed by the boy, who found himself amidst such congenial environments for the first time. The talks with the travelers of the caravans paled into insignificance when compared with these of the great occult teachers of Israel. For be it remembered that it was the custom of the great teachers of that day to so instruct those who were attracted to their company. And to Jerusalem, being the center of the culture and learning of Israel, the great teachers dwelt there. And so it will be seen that Jesus now found himself at the very fountainhead of the Hebrew secret doctrines and in the actual presence of the great teachers. And on the third day, there began a breaking up of the vast gathering of the 2 million people who had made the pilgrimage to the holy city. Those poorer in purse were the first to leave after the obligatory rites of the first 2 days had been performed. Joseph and Mary were among those preparing to retrace their steps to their distant homes. Their friends and neighbors gathered together, and their preparations for the return were completed. But at the last moment, the parents discovered that the boy, Jesus, was missing. They were alarmed, but friends told them that their boy had been seen in the company of kinsmen and neighbors traveling along the same road, who had preceded them by but a few hours. So somewhat reassured, the parents left with their company, hoping that they would overtake the boy before nightfall. But when they reached the first station on the caravan route, a village called Beroth, Beroth, and the night descended upon them, and the boy failed to appear among the neighbors and kinsmen, the parents were sorely distressed. They slept but little that night, and when the first rays of dawn appeared, they parted from the company and retraced their way back to Jerusalem, in search of the boy apparently lost in the great capital amid the hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. Every mother and father will enter into the feelings of Joseph and Mary in their frantic return to the city and in their subsequent search for the lost child. They inquired here and there for the boy, but not a trace of him was found. And the night came without a ray of hope, and the next day was likewise barren of results, and the next day after, for 3 days, the devoted parents searched high and low for their beloved child, but no word of encouragement came to them. The boy had seemingly dropped out of sight in the vast crowds and the winding streets, and the parents reproached themselves for their lack of care and caution. None but a parent can imagine their anguish and terror. They visited the many courts of the temple many times, but no sight or word of the boy rewarded their search. The bloody altars, the showy costumes of the priests, the chants, the readings, seemed like mockery to them. They wished themselves back in their humble village with their boy by their side, and they prayed and they besought Jehovah to grant their hopes and desire, but no answer came. Then, on the last day, a strange event occurred. The weary and heartbroken parents wandered once more into the temple, this time visiting one of the less frequented courts. And they saw a crowd gather. Something of importance was occurring. Almost instinctively, they drew near the crowd. Then, amidst the unusual silence of the people, they heard a boyish voice raised to a pitch adapted to a large circle of hearers and speaking in the tones of authority. It was the voice of the boy. Jesus. With eager feet, the couple pushed forward under the very inner row of the circle, and there, wonder of wonders, they saw their child. In the center of the most celebrated teachers and doctors of the law in all Israel. With a rapt expression in his eyes as if he were gazing upon things not of this world, the boy Jesus was standing in a position, an attitude of authority, and around him were grouped the greatest minds of the day and the land in respectful attention, while at a further distance stood the great circle of the common people. When one remembers the Jewish racial trait of reverence for age and the consequent submission of youth, one will better understand the unusual spectacle that burst upon the gaze of Joseph and Mary. A mere boy, a child, daring to even speak boldly in the presence of the aged teachers was unheard of. Unheard of. And the thought of such a tone actually presuming to dispute, argue, and teach in such an assembly was like unto a miracle. And such it was. The boy spoke with the air and in the tones of a master. He met the most subtle arguments and objections of the elders with the power of the keenest intellect and spiritual insight. He brushed aside the sophistries with a contemptuous phrase and brought back the argument to the vital point. The crowd gathered in greater volume. The gray heads and beards grew more and more respectful. It was evident to all that a master had arisen in Israel in the form of a boy of 13. The master was apparent. The master, apparent in tone, gesture, and thought. The mystic had found his first audience, and his congregation was composed of the leading thinkers and teachers of the land. The insight of the Magi was verified. Then, in a momentary pause in the argument, the stifled cry of a woman was heard, the voice of the mother. The crowd turned impatient, reproachful glances upon Mary, who had been unable to restrain her emotion. But the boy, looking sadly but affectionately at his lost parents, he gave her a reassuring glance, which at the same time bade her remain still until he had finished his discourse, and the parents obeyed the newly awakened will of the child. The teaching ended, and the boy stepped from his position with the air of one of the elders and rejoined his parents, who passed as rapidly as possible from the wondering crowd. Then his mother reproached him, telling him of their distress and wearisome search. The boy listened calmly and patiently until she had finished, and then he asked with his newly acquired air of authority, "Why sought ye me?" And when they answered him in the customary manner of parents, the boy took on still a greater air of authority, and in tones that, though kindly, were full of power, he replied, "Know ye not that I must be in my Father's house? I must be about the things of my Father." And the parents, feeling themselves in the presence of the mystery that had ever been about the child, followed him silently from the temple grounds. And here closes the New Testament story of the boy Jesus at the age of 13, which story is not resumed until his appearance at the place of the preaching of John the Baptist over 17 years later, when the boy had reached the age of a man of 30 years. When and how did he spend those 17 years? The New Testament is totally silent on this score. Can anyone who has read the above imagine that Jesus spent his years as a growing youth and young man working at his father's carpenter bench in the village of Nazareth? Would not the Master, having found his strength and power, have insisted upon developing those? Could the divine genius, once self-recognized, be content to be obscured among material pursuits? The New Testament is silent, but the occult traditions and mystic legends tell us the story of the missing 17 years. And these we shall now give to you. And here we will end part way through the lesson. This is part 1 of lesson 3, the mystic youth of Jesus. In the next video, we will continue part 2, which will begin with the legends and traditions of the mystic and occult organizations and brotherhoods. Tell us that after the occurrence of Jesus and the elders in the temple and his recovery by his parents, the latter were approached by members of the secret organization to which the Magi belonged, who pointed out to the parents the injustice of the plan of keeping the lad at the carpenter's bench when he had shown evidences of such a marvelous spiritual development and such a wonderful intellectual grasp of weighty subjects. It's told that after a long and serious consideration of the matter, the parents finally consented to the plan advanced by the Magi and allowed them to take the lad with them into their own land and retreats, that he might there receive the instructions for which his soul craved and for which his mind was fitted. But that's for the next video. See you there.